I call Dr. David Clark.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that was a short and interesting contribution from that member opposite. Probably it was short, say my colleagues, that they're more than willing to agree with that statement. There's actually not much to say. I think that speech spoke for itself. But I do want to take up some of the earlier points raised in the debate on this matter, and in particular, firstly, some of the points raised by Andrew Williams, who indicated that New Zealand First would not be supporting this bill. I was confused by some of his logic in his argument, because some of it, to me, seemed to be an argument for supporting the bill and some of it against. He was concerned about the cost to taxpayers of the International Kyoto Agreement. We have signed up as a country to the agreement. Indeed, Jenny Shipley signed up to it originally, and it was ratified by Helen Clark. So we know that is something that's happened. The changes, the original emissions trading scheme, which was brought into this Parliament, was supported by that member's party, the New Zealand First Party. So they supported it coming into legislation. What if they are opposing it on the basis of the fact that it now will cost taxpayers more to meet those obligations? Then that I can understand, because that is indeed the effect of the bill. The bill is designed to increase the subsidy to polluters, to prolong the period in which polluters are not in the scheme, and to make sure that polluters don't begin to meet the costs of their pollution, and thereby keeping industries trapped as they are today without change, and in effect discouraging businesses from making positive contributions in the climate change area. The bill, as it was originally drafted, was designed to encourage businesses to consider carefully their investment decisions when making decisions around future infrastructure and investments, to ensure that they did not invest in carbon-intensive activities unless they thought they had a very real advantage internationally in that area, and therefore could afford the offsets that would be required for whatever activity that might be, and that might be for activities around mining and producing the materials necessary to make windmills, which make a longer term contribution, or solar panels, or whatever it is. There are reasons, as we know, that many of today's activities, which are regarded as amongst the dirtier activities, are actually required in the shorter term to take our country forward. Now, the scheme as it was designed to ensure that those industries that were engaged in those things which had an environmental cost were encouraged to offset that cost, and also to consider whether there wouldn't be a better way of doing things. And this the changes proposed in this bill make that question a little less directly posed, because the carbon price is effectively lowered with the 2-for-1 deal extended indefinitely by this government. So already the government had offered to pay for half of the pollution made by those industries that had not transitioned to a lower carbon solution. Now it's saying we'll do that forever, and again advantaging those businesses at the cost of taxpayers generally, because of course it's taxpayers, when the government offers those subsidies to polluters, it is taxpayers as a whole that end up paying for meeting our Kyoto obligations that the government has signed up to. So it's effectively a scheme which is designed so that taxpayers pick up more of the bill. It seems, I guess, at least consistent with the kind of ill-thought-through legislation we've often seen this national government bring to the House, legislation that increases costs on business, and that means that the taxpayer picks up the bill. But I want to strongly suggest that it is foolish for the long-term future of this country, because the original scheme was itself fairly modest. It set out expectations of a future carbon price and asked businesses to be making decisions, and consumers to be making decisions that helped transfer New Zealand into a future lower carbon economy that would be competitive in the years to come, and also obviously concerned with doing its fair share and its bit toward reducing emissions in our planet. One needs to, we know and we acknowledge, and the countries that sign up to Kyoto acknowledge that the world needs to move to a low carbon future if there is going to be sustainable life on this planet. And in order to do that, we need mechanisms to achieve that. An emissions trading scheme is just one such mechanism. The government signed up to the obligation, the Kyoto obligation. It's not at this stage proposing to renege on its international obligations. It's not proposing that we pull out of the UN agreement we've signed. It said we'll meet the costs, we'll meet the whatever $1 billion it costs, but we're actually going to shove that onto taxpayers. We're not going to encourage businesses to change. We're not going to provide the incentives. We're going to provide the subsidies to not change. We're going to encourage businesses to stay stagnant. We're not going to encourage them to change, and we're certainly not going to reward those relatively who are making the positive change. And I think that's disappointing. I think that is very disappointing, because it is a government that talks a lot about business but often makes changes which are actually bad for business. And again, in this legislation, it actually increases the uncertainty for business. We know that businesses that face costs associated with their emissions are not always going to be happy about that. When I worked on the original legislation, I remember talking to higher energy intensity businesses, and people who were their representatives told me, look, we will squeal if you put a price on carbon. But we'll squeal a lot louder if we don't have some certainty around it, if we don't have a neat transition in. What businesses really want is certainty for planning, so they can make the wise investment decisions that are in the interests of their business. And the role of government is to make sure that those wise business investment decisions are aligned with the wider interests of society. And what we see clearly in this bill is a government that is reneging on its responsibility to align the wider interests of society with business interests. So some specific examples. The transition phase puts back the date using a review system, National expects to end the transition phase by putting a date back in using its review system. Now that creates regulatory uncertainty. In the agricultural sector, the national government intends that agriculture will enter at a date set by their review of the scheme. Again, creating uncertainty. Businesses cannot plan in that environment, and it will depend upon the international negotiations, the government of the day, and a range of other factors, and it's very hard to do business planning on that basis. So it's disappointing for business. It's particularly disappointing in the agricultural sector, where the costs to be imposed were just 5% of pollution, and though it would have placed New Zealand dairy products in a premium place in the market, because it would be shown that we were taking our international obligations seriously. Instead, Mr. Speaker, we have a situation where New Zealand is seen to be fading away from its international obligations. It has high per capita emissions, and our international reputation is taking a battering. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, we have a situation where foresters are the losers. In this updated scheme, we have a likelihood of forestry going downhill. There'll be job losses. And Mr. McClay, who chaired the committee's own electorate, we will have job losses in the forestry sector directly, as forestry is the real loser in the way in which this scheme suppresses the carbon price indefinitely. The amendments that were put up in the name of Moana Maki, there was one very good amendment that would have seen some guarantee, at least, of some of the units having some value, which would have advantaged the foresters, but we saw there that that was defeated by the government, because it doesn't want a price signal in the market. Effectively, it's saying it doesn't want a market solution. This government seems determined to put all of the costs back onto taxpayers. And I think that is very disappointing, very disappointing. I personally believe that markets are often a very good solution. If they're properly regulated, they make excellent servants. They just make terrible masters. And when we let the markets rule, when they're clearly errant, when they are not working, we allow them to make us their servants. And this is disappointing, because we as taxpayers are carrying the can for this bad legislation, Mr. Speaker, and that is why the Labour Party opposes this legislation forcefully and regards the passage of this legislation as a great disappointment to New Zealanders and an embarrassment, really, for this Parliament.
I call Maggie Berry.